Tomorrow, of course, we host a webinar for the RBA Governor, and I've got some questions myself to the RBA Governor. I want to put a bit of background to where I'm going with those questions, and it sort of fits pretty well into what the RBA Governor said yesterday in his press conference. It's really good that what we get now from the RBA Governor is not just the formal statement that that has been issued following meetings, but he's also now doing a press conference after the nature of what the Federal Reserve does and the European Central Bank does. What's really good about that is that the statement that he provides to that press conference is actually got a lot more detail and it's got a lot more feel in it than the simple monetary policy statement that is released after the RBA lunch. So, set a bit of background. I went to a presentation by Philip Lowe, our governor, in 2019, which was in dinner in Sydney, and at that he talked about the possible introduction of quantitative easing. The RBA had never done it before, and he was sort of feeling out various set of ground rules. Pretty much the international ground rules and the ground rules from the Fed, but also adopted by the RBA, were set the following January in a presentation I went to by Ben Bernanke, which was his presidential address at to the American Economics Association, and that year it was held in San Diego. And what Bernanke was dealing with in his speech was the problem that the equilibrium long-term interest rate that was available to policymakers and central banks had been falling over the years. And now it was pretty much around about the same, we'd expect the long-term average interest rate, or the short rate, to be around about the same as where inflation was. And the inflation target pretty much everywhere is about 2%. And the problem about that is, he said that in a normal cycle, when you get a slowdown, that what the Fed has done in pretty much every major slowdown is it's cut interest rates by at least 5%. Well, you've got a real problem if you're starting with an interest rate which on long-term average is 2%. So how do you get yourself out of that problem? Well, there's two ways of doing it. You increase your average inflation target from 2% to 5%, and that might be my second question to the RBA Governor tomorrow. But what's more practical is that you adopt quantitative easing. And with quantitative easing, by the way, and you have to do quantitative easing every business cycle from now on if you're stuck with that average level of low interest rates. So that was the first thing in his speech, that really quantitative easing is a workhorse of every business cycle from now on. But he said that with quantitative easing, you could add about 3% range to a policy range, so that you could get the same effect as an additional 3% cut in short rates by providing quantitative easing, as long as you continued your quantitative easing, that is to say your bond buying program, up until you had at least achieved what your inflation target was. So where's our inflation target now for the RBA? The inflation target for the RBA is it wants to have achieved an inflation target of between 2 and 3% for a while, for pretty much what the Fed says, for a substantial period. And that's the background that we have. If you think in terms of that background, you can understand why it is that quantitative easing has to go on for a lot longer, and why it is that the RBA Governor said in his press conference yesterday that he didn't see in terms of their scenario that they were going to put up the RBA cash rate before 2024, which is the kind, and this is the kind of country that I've been going over. So what we had yesterday in terms of tapering was very, 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 very slight in comparison to the way it may have been reported by the media. We did see the end of what the Bank of England would call our funding for lending program, our term funding facility. It hasn't come to an end, but the RBA stopped providing a new funding under that as of the 30th of June. And that was supporting the banking system, is supporting the banking system, and continues to support the banking system, and that money rolls forward for another 3 years. But there'll be no new advances under that system. And the purpose for that is that as the RBA is now moving, as the Governor said in his presentation yesterday, from a situation of rescuing the Australian economy into supporting an expansion of the Australian economy. So we've moved out of the emergency period into a solid expansion. So therefore, that's the reason that they continue with the target for the 3-year bond. That's the reason that they continue the bond buying program. Now, there's an observed reduction in the rate at which the RBA is buying 10-year bonds. It's reduced from $5 billion a week to $4 billion a week. But you still wind up with the RBA owning about 30% of all the bonds in Australia. By the time this is finished, the majority of those bonds are government bonds, but they're also buying a proportion of state government bonds. But that process will continue to go on now. That process will continue to go on until such time as the RBA achieves its inflation target, which he doesn't believe it'll achieve its target before the end of 2023, and it doesn't believe that it'll be putting up rates before 2024. So that bond buying program is going to go on for a while. Now, what does that bond buying program achieve? It's really interesting what he says in his press conference about it. He says the program has lowered the risk-free yields across the curve to Australia, thereby lowering funding costs to all borrowers. But also, this has contributed to a lower exchange rate. And I've talked about this before, about the RBA attempting to slow the rate of growth of the Aussie dollar. And I've said that they can slow it but not stop it. And we'll see that played out over the balance of this financial year. But it also frees up the cash flows for households and businesses, the Governor says, and strengthens balance sheet by supporting asset values. I hope he's thinking about the stock market because it certainly adds. He said they'll continue to buy the bonds at the current 80%, 20% split between Australian government securities and the securities issued by states and territories, and these purchases will be at a rate of $4 billion a week rather than $5 billion a week under the current program. And my looking back at the program, it actually started at 4 and a bit, went up to 5, and now is coming back to where it started with at 4. And it's kind of interesting that this is not what's happening over the period in which he's reducing the bond purchases is the Australian budget deficit is actually going down. So there's fewer bonds to buy, and so he's taking up around about the same amount proportion of a smaller quantity of bonds that are being issued. But he says it's really important to be able to vary that bonds because there's a benefit to not being locked in to a particular path or extended period. If I go back to my discussion of Ben Bernanke's discussion of the ground rules for quantitative easing, what I got the impression from him, what he said was that you get about 3%, you need about 5% effective range in cutting rates. You can't get that anymore just from cutting rates, so you get about 3% of that from quantitative easing and about 2% from cutting rates. So we are going to be varying that rate of bond buying and up until such time, but still supporting the bond market and keeping interest rates low until such time as we hit the inflation target and then some. Oh, and before I leave the issue, he also talked about supporting wages growth, and he wants wages growth to be growing at a faster rate than 3%, and he can't do that unless he gets unemployment down to 4.5%. And like I've been saying for some time, he needs to consistently support employment growth in Australia and have employment consistently below that 4.5% if he's going to get enough wages growth to hit that 3% target. So we got a lot more support coming and a lot more bond buying coming from the Reserve Bank of Australia. And we'll be talking about that again on the webinar tomorrow.